I request all of you to please be seated. हेलो कर दिया सब बैठ गए टेकिंग दिस Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and best wishes for Navroz, and a very warm welcome to 2nd SBI Banking and Economic Conclave 2015 on the theme, India Growth Story, What Needs to be Done. We are especially thankful to Honorable Union Finance Minister, Shri Arun Jaitley ji, who has taken out time from his extremely busy schedule to come for our inaugural session. The Honorable Minister of State Finance, Shri Jayant Sinha ji, who has consented to be the guest of honor, and Dr. Hasmukh Adia, Secretary Financial Services. I now request our Chairman, Srimati Arundhati Bhattacharya ji, to kindly escort the guests to the dais. We at SBI are very conscious of our carbon footprint, and it is our endeavor that we change our business processes in such a way that we protect our environment. Towards that, we have launched a lot of initiatives, mobile banking, internet banking, and today we launched SBI Buddy, an e-wallet. Besides this, we do many other activities to protect the environment, and one of the ways is also to honor our guest by planting trees. And when we plant 101 trees, a green certificate is generated, which we gift to our esteemed guests. So I'll request today our Chairman Madam to kindly present the green certificate to Finance Minister Shri Arun Jaitley ji. I'll now request Chairman Madam to please present the green certificate to Honorable State Minister for Finance, Shri Jayant Sinha ji. And I now request Chairman Madam to please present the green certificate to Dr. Adia, Secretary, Department of Financial Services. Thank you, ma'am. Now we'll request ma'am to give her welcome address.
Good evening, distinguished guests, Honorable Finance Minister, Sri Arun Jaitley ji, Honorable Minister of State for Finance, Sri Jayant Sinha ji, Secretary DFS, Dr. Hasmukh Adia, doyens of industry, invitees from the print and electronic media, my colleagues from the banking fraternity, ladies and gentlemen. I am grateful that the Finance Minister and the Minister of State for Finance are amongst us today. I extend a warm welcome to both of them and to all the distinguished invitees for the opening session of the second SBI Banking and Economics Conclave 2015. The SBI Banking and Economics Conclave is the flagship annual event of State Bank of India, a one of its kind in the industry. India, over the last 20 years, has migrated from the command and control regime to a more liberalized economic regime. Consequently, economic policy making and its execution has become more consultative in order to accommodate all stakeholders. The trends in this direction are gathering force by the day. The idea of SBI Banking and Economic Conclave was the product of this trend, and our efforts through this conclave are twofold. First, to enrich our understanding through appreciation of multiple viewpoints, and second, to arrive at some agreement on how to resolve complex problems through focused open discussions and thereby put together an indicative roadmap for the future. Let me share with you a story from Hollywood. Those of you who are fans of Sylvester Stallone must be aware of the cult movie Rocky. Sylvester Stallone was a struggling actor at that time, but his dream was to become a star in Hollywood. He wrote the script of Rocky and took his script to various production houses with the sole condition that he should star as the main lead in the movie. With his unconventional looks, the production houses were not ready to bet on him. But he still persisted, and finally, his perseverance paid off, with one production house agreeing to his demand. The rest, as they say, is history. The movie became a blockbuster, and Stallone became a household name. The quote from Rocky says it all. You, me, or nobody is gonna hit as hard as life. But it ain't about how hard you hit. It's about how hard you can get hit and keep moving forward. How much you can take and keep moving forward. That's how winning is done. In fact, early in the morning when I go through the newspapers, I very often connect with this quote, especially after the media has had a swipe at the PSBs and especially SBI. So I think, this really gels with my thought. However, in India, we as a country too have resurfaced through tough economic conditions with growth inching up again. But we have to go up further. If we show courage and perseverance, we can propel India towards the magnificent future which awaits it. Last year, when the maiden conclave was held, the general mood of the country had lifted following the conclusion of general elections. It is over a year since then. It's time to look back as well as look forward. A lot has been done in the last 1 year, and a clear strategic policy direction has been set and has been put to execution through several landmark schemes. Some of the laudable policy efforts of the government include the Make in India initiative. The new Foreign Trade Policy 2015-20 has been notified, which lays emphasis on leveraging upon global value chains and positions of Indian manufacturing in such global value chains. The new FDI policy, by opening up defense sector, has not only paved the way of developing of indigenous defense capabilities, but also for unlocking the socially positive spillover effect of indigenously developed dual-use technology. The government has recognized that without partnering states, balanced economic progress is not possible. Hence, by accepting the recommendations of the 14th Finance Commission, the government has set a good example in cooperative federalism. Once GST is operational, the full potential of cooperative federalism will, we expect, pay rich economic dividends. The landmark schemes of the government like the Pradhan Mantri Jan Dhan Yojana, the Mudra Bank, Krishi Sinchai Yojana, Deen Dayal Upadhyay Gram Jyoti Yojana, which envisages feeder separation between rural households and agriculture, Swachh Bharat Abhiyan, the Soil Health Card Scheme, Agri-Tech Infrastructure Fund, and Price Stabilization Fund are truly commendable in their design and vision. The Union Cabinet also recently gave its approval to create a rupees 20,000 crore National Investment and Infrastructure Fund to give a boost to infrastructure projects, including those which are stalled. The Cabinet also gave its approval to foreign investment in the alternative investment funds for facilitating domestic investment. However, there is one area where the efforts of the government has been remarkable, but perhaps has not gathered the appreciation it deserves. Over the last 1 year, through use of economic diplomacy, the government has succeeded in projecting India as one of the best places for foreign investment. The Baseline Profitability Index 2015 placed India in first spot as perception of corruption was down and investors were better protected following the election of the new government. After the crucial foreign visits by the Prime Minister during the last 1 year, countries like China, Japan, and now even the Middle East and others have committed sizable funds for investment in many areas. Yet, despite these efforts, young India is not contented. They harbor high ambitions. Therefore, in continuation to our efforts of last year, the theme of this year's conclave is India's growth story, what needs to be done. Macro management entails not only long-term planning, but also short-term planning. This year's conclave focuses on the latter. The economic environment abroad has become more challenging. Although international agencies like the IMF have pegged global GDP growth at 3.3% this year, the risks to growth weigh towards the downside. In fact, today itself, as you are aware, Moody's has said that the growth in India would probably be around 7% and not 7.5%. Unexpected monetary policy action by central banks such as the Swiss National Bank abandoning the peg and recent devaluation of yuan have made calibration of domestic policy more challenging. Macro management has become challenging when domestic environment has improved considerably with inflation softening, external value of the rupee, although volatile but stable. Hence, within this broad theme, the conclave has 4 subtopics. These are agendas to rev up growth, and CEOs from the industry will share their views on this. Economic progress will not be on sound footing unless banks are adequately capitalized. Therefore, is capital for Indian banks hindering growth or hindered by market? And should the economic discourse move beyond CPI and repo rate as tools of macro policy are pertinent questions to ask. We pose these questions to CFOs and experts in the subject of economics. However, there is another area which in our opinion is of utmost importance and cannot be neglected. This is the whole debate of judicial reforms and the interaction of judicial and legal system with economy in general. The government, on the recommendation of Law Commission of India, has repealed many obsolete laws, revised draft of the Indian Financial Code, which is currently in the consultative stage and has been open for stakeholder comments. Many such other provisions are under consideration to harmonize laws and attune them to the new economic realities. Accordingly, this year's conclave has a special topic, banking and judiciary, the missing link. Central issue of discussion here is, can the law help in making India the best country to do business in by swiftly deciding on conflict areas so as to ensure fair play and rule of law while encouraging entrepreneurship and innovation? Let me now turn to today's proceedings. The SBI family is truly honored that both the Finance Minister, Shri Arun Jaitley ji, and the Honorable Minister of State Finance, Shri Jayant Sinha ji, are with us this evening. I thank them for taking the time out and gracing this occasion. I am sure there are many in this August gathering who want to ask the government many questions but didn't have a chance to do so. We hope to provide just such an opportunity through an audience interaction with both the Finance Minister and the Minister of State immediately after their address. I welcome the gathering to enthusiastically participate in this session. I once again warmly welcome all the dignitaries to the opening session of the second SBI Banking and Economics Conclave 2015. I hope you have a pleasant, fruitful, and satisfying evening. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam. Now I'll request Honorable Minister for State, Shri Jayant Sinha ji, to share his thoughts with us.
Honorable Finance Minister Shri Arun Jaitley ji, DFS Secretary Dr. Hasmukh Adhia ji, Chairman State Bank of India Srimati Arundhati Bhattacharya, ladies and gentlemen, media members who are here and covering all of this in full strength. Srimati Bhattacharya has posed a very interesting question in her talk and is also the question that's laid out here on the screen. And the question really is, are we seizing the moment right now? Given the economic situation, are we making the progress that we need to make, and are we really getting it done just now? Today is a profound moment in India's history. It's a profound moment because after a long time, the challenges that we confront, the challenges of a young workforce, global climate change, institutional drift, these challenges are finally being confronted by a decisive mandate and great leadership. And therefore, this is a profound moment in India's history, and really the question for us is, can we seize the moment? I think, and I'll make the case, that indeed we can answer a resounding yes to that, and we can say with confidence that we are in fact seizing the moment. And I think the fundamental difference between the past few years, the decay and stagnation of the past few years, and the energy and vigor of what is happening now is driven by great leadership. The great leadership of the Honorable Prime Minister, the great leadership of the Honorable Finance Minister, and other senior colleagues in the cabinet. That is what, friends, is making the difference. Let's consider our macro situation. India was a macroeconomic basket case a year ago when we assumed office. All of you will agree that all the macroeconomic indicators were in a very, very negative territory and moving south. And in a year, we've turned all of that around. And it has happened because of the leadership, because of the decisive actions, the work that we did as far as minimum support prices are concerned, the difficult decisions that we made on fiscal management, on monetary policy. Those were the actions, those were the decisive decisions that were done that have really stabilized our macroeconomic situation and have led to a situation where the World Bank, the IMF, and external agencies believe that India is one of the few bright spots in the global economic climate. Of course, we have been helped by commodity prices. But that makes it all the more important for us to seize the moment. And there again, we have taken, I think, very wise actions by raising excise taxes on petrol and diesel, which enabled us to create more fiscal space so that we can invest in India's growth and prosperity. And there again, we have demonstrated, I think, very decisive and strong leadership. Of course, we have been helped by another factor. You have two FMs here, the Honorable Finance Minister and myself. But the real FM, the joke is, in India, is the monsoon. And the real FM is in fact showing up in good strength, and I think we are going to have a good monsoon, and that of course will reduce some of the concern that people have around food inflation and prices. And while we have an independent central bank, that does not take its cues from the finance minister, but it does take its cues from the other finance minister, which is the monsoon. Hopefully, that will put us in a very comfortable zone when it comes to monetary policy as well. So all of that together, ladies and gentlemen, all of that together should reassure you that we have built a very solid and a very strong macroeconomic foundation for our future growth. And the growth drivers are in place. Of course, we are going to get the cyclical upswing that comes at this point in the economic cycle. Rates are coming down, hopefully will continue to come down, and that in itself will spur consumption and investment. But along with the cyclical upswing, we have public investment that is growing very quickly. As you might know from the data that's been released, public investment itself between Q1 last year and Q1 this year is up 38%. So public investment is picking up. FDI is growing at unprecedented levels. Capital flows in India have been very strong, and in an environment where emerging markets are seeing outflows, so we've done really well there. And then when it comes to structural reforms, whether it is in banking, whether it is GST, whether it is in spurring an alternative investments universe, in all those different areas, in agriculture, in Make in India, we are really putting in place the structural reforms that will genuinely boost the economy going forward. So the growth drivers are also in place. So with a strong macroeconomy, with these growth drivers in place, I think we can feel confident that we can sustain growth of 8, 9, 10% a year for the next few years. And that is indeed good news for India. That is indeed, something that should inspire confidence in us that we will be able to sustain this growth. But there is more. And we have to look beyond the medium term. We have to consider the long term. We have to consider how we are going to compete with the US, with the European Union, with China in the decades to follow. And that's where the story, I think, gets even better. Because innovation is booming in India. Innovation is booming in an unprecedented way. The number of innovators and entrepreneurs is growing exponentially, and that bodes very well for India's long-term future. And we are very, very committed to supporting innovation and entrepreneurship. The Honorable Prime Minister said from the ramparts of Red Fort that we are really going to support Startup India, and we are very committed to doing that. And there is innovation and entrepreneurship, not just in the private sector, but also in the public sector. The work that we're doing with the Jan Dhan Yojana, the Jan Suraksha, under the leadership of Dr. Adhya, the manner in which we have reached every nook and cranny of India, gotten bank accounts to every single family in India, and now what we're doing through insurance, through health cover, and so on, is going to create a social security net for every single Indian. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is a great innovation in governance and in public policy in India, the fact that we are going to be able to put together this universal social security. And while all of this is happening, the industries of the future are also coming together. I see in front of me, leaders of industry that are really enabling defense industry to grow. At the same time, the medical device industry, the healthcare industry, all of that is growing as well. And so, whether we look at what is happening right now as far as the macroeconomy is concerned, whether we look at the growth drivers that have been put in place, or the innovation that's required for the long term, ladies and gentlemen, I'm sure you'll agree with me. I'm sure you'll join me in saying that we have, in fact, seized the moment. The future is very bright for India, and please work with us in helping create the growth and the jobs that India so sorely needs right now. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, sir, for sharing your valuable thoughts with us. They were indeed very insightful, especially about microeconomy today and future. Now I'll request Honorable Finance Minister Shri Arun Jaitley ji to kindly address the gathering and share his thoughts on the growth agenda. Thank you, sir.
Hello. My colleague, is it loud enough?
It's going.
My colleague Shri Jayant Sinha ji, Dr. Adhya, Mrs. Bhattacharya, and friends. I'm extremely grateful to the State Bank and its chairperson, Mrs. Bhattacharya, for having organized this summit to discuss where we stand today. It's quite obvious that with regard to the growth story of India, what needs to be done, itself is an issue which is on everyone's mind. We've just seen an extremely disappointing but a very educative session of Parliament come to an end. It was disappointing because what we thought would happen in this session did not happen. And it was educative because it's enabled us to understand the entire politics of the reform process in India. And I think it is the second question which relates to the politics of the reform process itself, on which the answer to your question as to what needs to be done to the reform story in India itself can get answered. The world is passing through extremely challenging and difficult times. It's passing through a phase which very few had at one stage anticipated. We have many who after the event claim credit for having said so. But at least I don't recollect 2 years ago, 1.5 years ago, reading anywhere about the kind of things which were likely to happen. And in this scenario, you obviously have the disadvantage of a somewhat slowed down global situation, which doesn't exactly give you the most favorable winds to grow. But at the same time, it also provides you an opportunity. The oil prices, the commodity prices have all created a situation where there is a transfer of wealth taking place from many a producing nations to many a consuming nations. And particularly as far as the oil situation is concerned, being a hugely consuming nation, we stand to benefit from this transfer of wealth which is taking place. And if we are in a position to put our house in order, particularly because we have a lot of many competing economies facing challenges of their own kind, we obviously have an opportunity where we can exploit the current global situation to our advantage. Jayant just now mentioned that India's real potential lies in evolving ourselves from a 7-8% growth rate to a 9-10% growth rate. And if we are to reach that range of 8 to 10% and continue in that range for a significant number of years, it's only then that we'll be able to find an answer to India's poverty. It's only then that we'll be able to create jobs. It's only then that we are going to be elevated to the category of a society which is able to realize its entire full potential. Of course, we have only few indications as yet which are positive. There are also challenging indications. Any banker would tell you that the challenging indication is that the credit offtake is still slow. On the positive side, our services will grow well. The rain gods have been somewhat kinder to us this year. The timetable and the schedule of the monsoon, its geographical extent, except for two patches, Marathwada and Rayalaseema, By and large, there have been adequate rains in most parts of the country, and therefore we are expecting a good harvest. On the manufacturing front, 1/3 of the year is over till July, and indirect tax revenues, which are a good indication, because 4 consecutive months is not a patchy indication, it indicates a trend, have been reasonably good. Inflation is under control, and hopefully the impact of inflation being under control is a factor which I am sure the central bank, with all its wisdom, will also take note of. But then a larger question is asked, is Indian politics mature enough to really be in a position to seize this opportunity and convert this otherwise adverse global situation into a challenging situation? No country, no society, no government is able to implement reforms and changes till the Prime Minister is willing to lead in that direction. And we are fortunate to have a Prime Minister who's willing to take many, many steps in this direction. Unlike the previous UPA government, you have a government where there is no debate within the government. In the last government, the 10 years were spent because there was a vertical ideological divide in the government. You had the finance managers of the government thinking in one direction, you had the party and the power centers thinking in another direction, and obviously they prevailed. And therefore a decade became a lost decade, a wasted decade. Now, presently, we have no such problems. We also have a government which has a clear mandate in the Lok Sabha. And with a mandate in the Lok Sabha, it's able to push through not merely legislation in the lower house, but it can also has the adequate support numbers to push through a constitutional amendment in the lower house. How do you then take decisions with regard to the reform process? You have executive action on which there is no embargo. You have money bills. This year, along with the finance bill, I was able to pass 7 other money bills. And I must appreciate the wisdom of our framers of the Constitution that they envisage that the money bill doesn't go to the upper house. You have legislations which have to be cleared by both houses, and you have, at least in one case, the goods and services tax, the Constitution amendment. And I think India is getting increasingly polarized between those who want to grow and those who want to obstruct. Not a highly desirable polarization, but when I said that the last session of Parliament was disappointing but educative, I think it is the second part which has increasingly become clear. Otherwise, how would you have a political party which envisaged the GST in 2006, which introduced it in 2011, and in 2000, whose every state government supported it, and in 2015, it decided to come out with some make-believe objections. And that is what compels me to feel that politics is increasingly getting polarized between an India which wants to grow and a minuscule section of this country confined to a small strength in the parliament which actually wants to obstruct. And I think it's extremely important in order to answer Mrs. Bhattacharya's question. How do you go about it with this growth story? One needs to understand the whole politics of reforms. When faced with this challenge, I've been reading and trying to understand how other societies in the world tried to face with this situation. And a very interesting parallel has emerged from the history of changes that were brought about in Great Britain because of this. You had the House of Commons, which had a mandate from the people. And you had the upper house, where earlier people were nominated as the hereditary peers. That system changed and it remained broadly a house which was nominated. Now, without being aware of it at that time, about 4 months ago, after the budget session, I wrote a blog in which I raised a question. I didn't anticipate what was going to come in the next few months. And I raised a political and a constitutional issue that in a democracy, to what extent can an indirectly elected house obstruct the decisions of a directly elected house? The directly elected house has a popular mandate. A directly elected house represents the will of people. Now, I can quite understand as a check and balance on the powers of an indirectly elected house. An indirectly elected house can confer its wisdom once or twice. But if we see the character of India's politics, because the upper house is a council of states, you have a given number of states because the composition of the house changes and evolves slowly, but doesn't exactly keep pace with the political complexion of the lower house. At least in the last 20 years, it hasn't. Now, this question was raised in 1885 in England, when they found a situation that the House of Lords was interdicting and stopping the decisions of the House of Commons. And with the maturity of democracy with no written constitution, just one man espoused a theory in England, and it then got to be known as the Salisbury Doctrine. There have been very scholarly writings on it. But it was still being debated. And the doctrine was that ordinarily you should not obstruct the decision of the directly elected house. Even if you did, on a second or a third reading, you must accept the decision of the directly elected house, because there is a mandate doctrine. There is a manifesto doctrine. The lower house is elected on the strength of a manifesto. And once there is a popular sanction behind that manifesto, and there is a mandate, on a second or a third reading, the upper house must accept it. It remained debatable. Until Clement Attlee became the Prime Minister in 1945, and he, as the Labour Party Prime Minister, wanted to implement a lot of social security schemes after the war. Obviously, the Conservatives didn't agree with him. And the House of Lords was full of the Conservatives. So they could stop a lot of them. And then there was a political consensus which has since worked, And this doctrine itself evolved into a Salisbury-Addison doctrine. And this principle, though nowhere written, with the maturity of democracy got accepted. Now, I think time has come for this question to be answered. When I raised this question in a blog, the Congress party filed a breach of privilege notice against me that I had insulted the upper house in India. That notice is still pending. And I think for years to come, when governments at center will rule, and the Council of States will comprise of representatives of state governments, many a governments would be faced with this situation. And therefore, time has come for us to find out the constitutional or at least as a matter of precedent, a conventional answer to this problem. Otherwise, a large number of steps which are extremely important would get struck. One answer lies in a question that if this stalemate or traffic jam remains, a lot of ordinary legislations would then have to be framed as money bills. Because societies which are alive will have to find answers as to how to grow. You can't have individual ambitions trying to obstruct a popular mandate. And when I said that the last session of Parliament was educative, the second factor that I had in mind was, we've seen many political obstructions to reform, but I've hardly ever seen such an immense popular support to a move like the GST. I almost didn't come across a single contrarian statement. Editorial after editorial, online petitions, opinions in the media, opinions on television, that we want changes because we find that the present system is now becoming retrograde. We cannot de-link it from the character of Indian politics. It's sad, but it is true that in a country where a lot of political parties are controlled by families, increasingly I now find that less and less number of businesses are controlled by families. After all, the whole concept of startups and technology-based industries, you have a lot of entrepreneurship which is resulting in leadership of businesses. Just as lesser and lesser number of businesses are controlled by families, more and more political parties are controlled by families. The contrarian is true. And families which control political parties and which have tasted political power believe that they have a divine right to be in power. Ultimately, if you go back to the darkest phase of Indian politics in recent history, the emergency, why did India lose its democracy during that period? If the then Prime Minister, Mrs. Gandhi, had resigned, another member of our party would have taken over. The opposition didn't have a majority. It would have been another congressman taken over. But the family thought it had a divine right to rule. And I regret to say that even in the recent politics of obstructionism, it is the loss of power where the loser feels that they have the divine right to rule, and once the right is denied to them, this converts itself into a right to obstruct. And it is here where these kind of tendencies come up in politics. I think it's about time that we set up some good conventions in order to decide, as the British did, as to how do you get the legislative sanction whenever it is required behind a reform. Having thrown up this larger question, my own answer to this has been, it's the strength of public opinion. It is safeguards such as joint sessions, it's safeguards such as money bills, which provides for legislation a part of the answer. For a constitutional amendment, probably there is no such answer, except as we grow, and I do see on the 4th of April 2016, the numbers somewhat changing even in the upper house, because that's an evolving process itself. But this whole spirit to reform in order to grow in the Indian society itself has to be carried through. Jayant just now mentioned things that we are seeing in the direction which we are seeing in the last 15 months. I think one of the first principles was that except in rare sectors, India must accept that it has to completely open out. And therefore, sector after sector, which remained closed, we have to offer ourselves as a recipient of global investment, and that is the direction in which the present policy regime of the government itself has moved. That I don't think was a very difficult decision. That was a low-hanging fruit. But the second part of the change process, where I can at best say there is still work in progress, is the easing of our processes. The easing of the processes has to take place at the central government. It has to take place in the states, it has to take place in the municipalities, it has to take place with regard to our regulators. It has to take place in the mindset of our courts. Otherwise, decisions with regard to investment which are taken, the time taken between the decision to invest and the time and between the actual production starting itself can be very long enough. And it is that dissuades people from investing. So from FIPB approvals to investment decisions to environmental clearances, it all has to move fast. The Indian media also has to realize that with regard to investment proposals, there is it's no advantage to create frenzies and hysterias in the media. I was just looking up the news on my phone just now while driving to this place, and I saw a surprise being expressed that the government had taken a decision which only enabled 60,000 people near Delhi to occupy their apartments which they have paid for. Now, there is no reason why people have paid for their apartments, they should be denied the right to live in them. And therefore, passing off such a decision as something unusual is not a very favorable environment that we create. Expenditure takes place in the states. And therefore, agreeing to empower the states. Now, I think one of the strong points of this whole GST debate was that even in the Rajya Sabha, the numbers were with the government because almost every regional or local party was with the government. And one of the reasons was that we'd been fair to them in accepting the recommendations of the 14th Finance Commission, which increased their shares by 10%. And even with regard to decisions like mining, etc., we were fair to the states to say that whoever produces the advantages of that natural resource must go to that state. Therefore, states like Bihar, which as consuming states would benefit, states like West Bengal, Orissa, which as mineral-rich states would benefit. You had most regional parties agreeing to support the proposals itself. And therefore, I think it's an important change that you empower the states and start trusting the states. Sovereignty rests not merely with the central government, it's a shared sovereignty which exists between different layers of elected people. The states also have mandate as far as their own elections are concerned. And therefore, it's extremely important that they are financially empowered. And resources with the state will eventually result in expenditure, greater expenditure taking place as far as the lower layer is concerned itself. It's equally important to get the Indian society to be freed from all forms of governmental discretions. One of the great successes of North Block that I find is that the numbers of visitors has declined. And the reason why the number of visitors has declined is because discretions itself have declined. And therefore, all kinds of resources, governmental discretions, to be by a publicly declared transparent process, auctions in most cases, I think it's a system which has started maturing in India. And I doubt very much if in future any government can reverse that course itself. That takes me to my first point. The consequence and result of this lowering of the oil and the commodity prices, etc., I think has created an environment where it is possible now to inculcate the habit in the people that users must pay. The extent of subsidy rationalization which has taken place in the last 15 months, without a single ripple being caused on account of this favorable environment. So people are now paying for their oil, they are paying for their diesel. The DBT experiment on LPG is a huge success. Hopefully it will be now extended to other areas. Experimentation is on. And all this has resulted in a huge amount of savings as far as the public exchequer is concerned. And those savings don't belong to the government. The losses of the oil companies have been compensated. And the cess imposed has enabled us to move a lot of resources which became available because of this towards infrastructure creation. And that itself has helped in infrastructure funding. Therefore, the amount of funds now available for the national highways, which 12 to 15 months ago had almost stagnated. Tender after tender, there were no bidders. Disputes were unresolved. And there an important movement itself has started. In rural roads, an important movement has started. The extent of amount now available, both from budgetary support to the railways, as also from tax-free bonds and other resources. The LIC itself has made a large corpus available for them. We are now closely monitoring, just as the highways and the rural roads have expedited their expenditure. the railways has to now expedite this expenditure very fast. And if they are able to spend substantial amount of the money available with them within this financial year, the lack of investment in the private sector can be to some extent offset by this. So infrastructural spending, and I quite understand, there's a very interesting relationship private sector businesses have with the government. I said this in a closed door meeting with the bank today morning, and I don't mind sharing it with you, that the private sector is very good when the going is good. In challenging situations, they expect governments to step in. And it's quite understandable. And these are for them challenging situations. In these situations, therefore, obviously to generate expenditure, the public expenditure and its quantum has to be increased. And the government is fully conscious of that responsibility. So the initiative now taken by setting up the India Investment Infrastructure Fund itself, the government is putting in its resource, the structure of the fund is ready, and we are getting to be in touch with a large number of international investors in this regard. The Prime Minister's visits internationally to various destinations are also resulting in a lot of interest being shown for investing in Indian infrastructure. Yesterday itself, the last 2 days itself was a very positive experience for us. The other area where we inherited a very difficult situation was the banks itself. I don't think it would be fair to say that the situation was alarming, but the situation was very challenging. And the slowdown in various sectors could adversely impact the capacity of the banks itself to become lenders in this whole developmental process. And therefore, last week we did come out with a very large number of suggestions with regard to the roadmap for the banks in the next few years. And one thing which the government is absolutely determined, well, recapitalization is the obvious that had to be done. But I think public sector banks also have to be run very, very professionally. So the selection of the personnel, the selection of the boards, the autonomy and independence in their own decision making, their commercial decisions being influenced and impacted by commercial principles. I think these are extremely important areas where which are going to be a part of the banking roadmap. And yet there are many where the challenges remain. Today when we discussed it in the board meeting, again several issues have come up. Several good suggestions came up with regard to reforming the whole DRT process itself so that it doesn't become just an alternative slow mechanism like a judicial process. Dr. Ardia is going to be working on this in the next few weeks. In fact, a very important piece of legislation which got held up but was not mentioned because of this disturbed parliament session. The very first bill listed in the Rajya Sabha was an amendment to the Prevention of Corruption Act. Now, the Prevention of Corruption Act itself was re-legislated in 1988. And 1988 predated the 1991 reforms. And therefore, some provisions in the changed economic environment have become completely obsolete. The Act now envisages erroneous decisions causing loss also to be an act of corruption. In fact, in the last 4 or 5 years, a large number of decisions which were not necessarily corrupt decisions but were erroneous decisions. So if a government is to take 10 decisions and one of them goes wrong, or a banker is to decide on 20 accounts and one of them goes wrong, the consequences can't be a criminal prosecution. Under the present law that exists today, it is prosecution. And that had compelled a situation in a lot of decisions of the government which were to be otherwise based on commercial considerations, as to defer a decision and not take a decision. In defense purchases, in disinvestment, every official in the ministry thought it was most prudent to allow his successor to take a decision. So one query would be made and the decision would again be set off for the next 6 months. India's defense preparedness has suffered because of that. Now that's one of the laws which is pending amendment at item number 1 in the Rajya Sabha. I think one of the other key areas of change and reform related to taxation. Now you have two distinct areas operating here. The first, of course, was direct taxes. And in direct taxes, one needed to smoothen up a lot of creases which otherwise existed. And we were bold enough to say that over the next 5 years, 4 years, we intend bringing down the rate of corporate direct tax to 25%. In indirect taxes, the GST itself is a landmark reform. Besides this, a large number of other changes had to take place. That's not a very easy thing to do, to reform taxation. Because the problem with taxation is that people don't like to pay taxes. And I am always disappointed when I see even thinking leaders of the industry come out with absurd propositions such as, I am against black money, but I am also against the steps being taken to recover black money. Which in fact you want this whole system to perpetuate. And I think this odd argument of rationalizing dishonesty by just paraphrasing it in this manner is no longer going to be acceptable to India, at least not to the government itself. A very important decision that we've taken in the course of this year is to put in a huge part of public investment into irrigation. We have cases after cases apparent before us. The Narmada got completed, and therefore parts of Madhya Pradesh and parts of Gujarat benefited. The interlinking of rivers, you can have smaller irrigation projects, you can have the river grid projects, has resulted in agriculture growing in a state like Madhya Pradesh at 18% and 20%. This has hugely increased the local purchasing power as far as agriculture is concerned. And in a phase where we've been passing through distress, I think if in the years to come our resource itself increases, one of the first destinations other than infrastructure really has to be irrigation itself. Because the more we invest there, the easier the returns in that segment are. Manufacturing, startups, Jayant just now mentioned, how to evolve ourselves into a low-cost manufacturing, considering some other competing economies are now facing challenging situations. How do we attract the investment in those areas? Our concentration on infrastructure creation, I think, will certainly add to that. Smart cities, real estate, also partly dependent on our interest costs, because you can't have idle capacities all over the country lying to that effect. The availability of land itself. Now, I've read studies which indicate that if India were to evolve from a developing economy into a developed economy, the total amount of agricultural land which will require conversion for that purpose will be 1%. So, exaggerated fears of food security being impacted will not work. In any case, today, our challenges are not scarcity. I think we were very competent in managing scarcities. Our real challenge is in managing the surplus. So whether it's wheat, it's rice, it's sugarcane, it's cotton, even in industrial products, the same. And therefore, it is these areas which are going to be in years to come the real drivers as far as the economy is concerned. We have some other issues on the legislative agenda which is extremely important as far as the reforms are concerned. The changes to the arbitration law in order to minimize judicial intervention, in order to provide for a fast-track arbitration, is now pending. The bankruptcy code is on the verge of completion as far as its preparation is concerned. It will require a legislative backing. The law relating to disputes in relation to major contracts, because you can't depend on the lethargy created in Indian courts that each dispute is pending for years together before it's resolved. You will have to have a fast-track methodology of resolving those disputes. And of course, a fair law which deals with a fair sense of public procurement itself. Now, these are all changes which in the months to come will come up before Parliament. And Indian Parliament will also then have to rise to a certain level of statesmanship. That level of statesmanship is that in this whole battle between growth and obstruction, public opinion has to create a sense of revulsion against obstruction. And it's only then, when the political cost of obstruction is very high, that you'll find obstruction being knocked out as a political strategy. You had a whole session wasted over a non-issue, and finally when there was a change of heart and on the last day the issue was debated, those propounding the issue got laughed out. We can't allow democracy and parliamentary processes to become so vulnerable. And now if we come back to Jayant's original question, that if from a 7 to 8% growth, we are to translate ourselves into an 8 to 10% growth, and that's your subject, Mrs. Bhattacharya, today, you have an answer right in front of you. And the answer really is that we have to concentrate on spending in infrastructure. We are doing well as far as our services are concerned. We are likely to do well as far as our agriculture is concerned. The big projects, a number of them have started, have to be continuously almost pushed by the day. So manufacturing improves. We have to concentrate on that manufacturing sector. We have to create an environment where people want to invest in this country. So our stalled projects moving, our manufacturing picking up, our infrastructure picking up, our concentration on irrigation expenditure, the GST being introduced, our direct taxes being more and more rationalized. Now, if we are to take each one of these logical steps, ultimately, it's that extra 1 to 2% growth that you are looking forward to. And the answer certainly is not rocket science. It's almost evident in front of us. And I think it's extremely important that on the strength of our public opinion in this whole process to make the economy grow, we convert our parliamentary democracy, which is a great asset for India, into a forum which celebrates this growth, rather than a forum which only enables a few to obstruct. And I'm quite sure the resilience of Indian democracy is such that those who obstruct will also certainly see reason in the days and years to come. Thank you.